Hi, today we're going to talk a little bit about timelines. This is chapter 1.3 in our Ohio is America book. And you're going to have the opportunity to read this chapter in the book, but I'm also going to hit some highlights for you to better prepare you to take your check-in on this information. Timelines, Ohio is America. If you took out your social studies journal, you could write down some things about time. For example, you could think about what tools do you use to tell time? What tools do you use? Do you use a sundial like ancient scholars used to do? Probably not. Do you use a watch or the clock on your phone or the clock on your computer or Chromebook? How do you know that time has passed over minutes, over hours, over days? Think about all the things that we use to keep track of time. You might use your assignment notebook. You might use a calendar on the wall. Think of all the tools that you can think of. Take a couple minutes and jot some down in your journal. You can pause this video and unpause it if needed. Okay, today we're going to learn about how historians tell time and use it to create stories. We're going to use it to learn how to read and use a timeline. We're going to learn the definitions of BC and AD. We're going to start by looking at this timeline. This timeline is a timeline of somebody's life. In somebody's life, he was born in 1961. He joined the Navy in 1982. So if we count that many years, we can tell that he was 21 when he joined the Navy because he was born in 1961 and he joined it in 1982. And 82 minus 61 is 21. We can tell that 4 years later, he gets married. 6 years later, he has twins with his wife Cheryl. And 16 years later, he becomes a music teacher. So a timeline helps us be able to look at the pattern of life events and to categorize them and be able to put them in order. It is a visual representation of showing historical events in the order that they occurred by the date. They put events in chronological order. Do you remember what chronological means? Chronological means time order. What happened first, second, third, fourth. Obviously, Scott had to be born before he could join the Navy. Okay? Now, he could have gotten married to Cheryl before he joined the Navy, but he didn't. So this is chronological order in the order of the events that they occurred. Chronological, another meaning, is to arrange events in order by the date or the time they occurred. This is looking at the dates, but we could look at it by the time. We could look at your class schedule and say, oh, at 7:30 a.m. you got out of bed. At 7:45 you had breakfast. At 8 o'clock you went in and did your classroom question and Google check-in. At 8:15 you went to your math class. That would be in order of the time they occurred as opposed to the date. Here's another sample of a timeline. You notice that this one goes up and down or vertical. Timelines can be either horizontal, going across, or vertical, going up and down. If they're horizontal, you're going to read them left to right, like you would read a book. If they're vertical, you're going to read them from the top to the bottom. Timelines have intervals. Intervals are the space between each date on a timeline. These spaces do not have to be the same length or the same amount. For example, on this timeline to the right, you notice that Japan invades Manchuria in 1931. The next event on our timeline doesn't occur until 1937, so there's a space of 6 years. But the next event occurs just 2 years later in 1939, so there's a space or an interval of only 2 years. So our intervals may not be the same amount. They can cover any amount of time. It could be a very short period of time or it could be a much longer period of time, depending on how the events occur. What do we use timelines for? In this picture, you see two timelines stacked on one another. Historians often use timelines, these multi-tier timelines, meaning two or more, to be able to look at what was happening in the top timeline, maybe in one part of the world, and what was happening in the bottom timeline, maybe in another part of the world. Or maybe this is what was happening in academia, in other words, in what was happening in writing and literature and learning. And maybe this was what was happening with different countries and their economies. So they could match up and see if there was any correlation or anything that made sense that they were all happening at the same time. So they could look at multiple timelines at one time by putting them on top of one another or stacking them. Labeling timelines. We use the Gregorian calendar to label the timeline. This is the calendar that we use today. Timelines also use the labels BC and AD. BC stands for before Christ. AD stands for Anno Domini, which is Latin for the year of our Lord Jesus Christ. Another thing for labeling timelines, now we are just beginning to see that some historians are now replacing BC with BCE and AD with CE. So what does that mean? BCE means before the Common Era. So instead of before Christ, before Common Times. AD, instead of meaning after death or Anno Domini, it means CE, the Common Era, or the era in which we live in currently. Labeling timelines, when we look at these, you're going to want to think about a number line and how a number line can have a 0, and we can have positive numbers to the right, and we can have negative numbers to the left. And the further away you get from 0, the larger the numbers get. Dates after 1 AD always add 1 year to the number. Dates before 1 BC always add 1 year to the number. This means that the higher an AD number is, the closer to present day that it is. So if something happened in 1940 AD, that's going to be closer to us in 2021 than something that happened in 1400 AD. We could look at that very simply because we all know 1776 was an important day for the United States. 1776 is much longer than something that happened in, let's say, 2010, when some of you might have been born, or 2011, or maybe even 2012, depending on how old you are. The higher a BC number is, the further it is from present day. So if you look here at the Great Pyramids, that was 2,584 BC. That means it was 2,584 years from the Common Era, but that was just the start of the Common Era. Then we have to add the 2021 years that we are since the Common Era has occurred. So if you really wanted to know about the Great Pyramids of Giza, we're talking about adding 2021 to 2,584. So really talking about something that happened over 4,600 years ago. So that's kind of a brief overview of timelines. What you're going to do now is you're going to open your reading assignment. You're going to read about timelines. But before you do, I highly encourage you to look at these reading questions, because these reading questions will give you some ideas of what might possibly be on your check-in today. As you read, look for the answers for these. That's going to help you out. Some of you did a fantastic job yesterday on your reading. Some of you, not so much. So make sure you slow down, take your time, and look for important words and details. Thank you. Have a great weekend, and I hope you do well on your work today.